A win like that had to feel good for Mountaineer fans, especially Mountaineer fans in attendance, as they were able to be inside Milan Puskar Stadium in Morgantown for the first time since 2019. Their Mountaineers impressed, but we will certainly talk about what that impressive, quote-unquote, win can really say about this team. Of course, that against Long Island, the Mountaineers winning 66-0, and this is a WVU edition of Pittsburgh Postgame here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, and of course, WV Sports Now. All our postgame coverage of the Mountaineers 66-0 trouncing of the Long Island Sharks is over there at WV Sports Now. I'm your host, as always, Mike Asti, and I will be joined by our Karl Ludwig of WV Sports Now to recap this game, really discuss what we can take away from this game and if we can take anything away from this game. And of course, I guess I'm kind of thankful there is another topic here. We have a quarterback discussion to have in this postgame show, and then preview a game that certainly will matter, and we will really be able to gauge this team in that contest against Virginia Tech in week 3 for the program. So to get things started, the Mountaineers win 66-0. 66-0. Now, of course, figuring to beat Long Island, but I don't know if everyone was figuring to win by this many points and to do it in shutout fashion. The fans able to be back there. It's a weird 5 p.m. kickoff that worked for tailgating. It was a great day down in Morgantown, and the Mountaineers did what they had to do. They do it with Jarret, they do it with Garrett, Greene, and they get the win. So, Karl, when you have a team winning 66-0, but doing it against an inferior opponent who you're assuming you would beat entering the game, nothing is guaranteed. We did see Duquesne beat Ohio on this same day, and we've seen Appalachian State beat Michigan in the past. But again, it would have been doomsday to have anything but a big win over Long Island. But a big win, to say the least, 66-0. So before we get into the quarterback possible controversy or any other topics to preview next week, what can you take away from a win like this for the Mountaineers? An impressive win by the scoreboard, but you have to take into account the opponent as well.
Well, I mean, it was a fun game tonight. I mean, obviously,
right,
winning by that many points, the biggest win since Clemson back in 2012. It's always fun. I mean, it helps the fan base feel maybe a bit better, maybe not over the Maryland game yet, but I mean, that feels good. I mean, winning by that much feels good. The whole team, it was not much went wrong for the Mountaineers tonight across all levels. I mean, maybe a fumble late in the game, a fourth down stop late in the game. But other than that, it was near perfection, and that feels good. But end of the day, though, LIU Post just isn't a very good team, unfortunately, for a measuring stick kind of game here. I mean, they're a small team. Right. Nothing against the team. They're 3 years up in the Division I football. So anything but a massive win would have been like a disaster, like you said. So not much to be taken away here. I think one big takeaway to kind of like jump into the QB talk is Doege seems to be he's the guy for Neal Brown, and that's kind of clear after tonight, despite how electric Garrett, Greene looked at times tonight.
Yeah, Jarret is the guy, clearly, and Jarret had to be the guy entering the season. I don't think it would have made sense for Jarret not to be the guy entering the season. Had a good camp, was better down the stretch last year, and we harp on this all the time, those of us in media and even fans of the team, but Neal Brown and Jarret have a very long personal relationship going back to when Jarret was 12 years old, and even a relationship with his brother. So Neal Brown probably doesn't want to pull this trigger in his heart of hearts, let alone not going to do it if he doesn't have to. Jarret looked good in this game, but Garrett, Greene also looked good in this game. So before we get to Doege, before we get to Doege, because I think also the thought process, I'm sure everyone's screaming, is you should look good against Long Island. Jarret looked good against Long Island, but didn't look good against Maryland. You're probably left going into Virginia Tech thinking Jarret Doege's not someone you're too excited about, because again, Long Island, it's hard to be that excited about. But again, looked really good against Long Island, took care of the business he had to take care of. But Garrett, Greene also entered the game. Before we get into evaluating these two, were you at all surprised how early Garrett, Greene entered this game? Obviously, the game was well in hand, but it wasn't like fourth quarter mop-up duty. This was clear that Neal Brown, in a way, might have been grooming Garrett Greene that if he has to pull this trigger down the stretch, maybe even in the Vautech game, that Garrett Greene would have some experience, because the reason why Jarret Doege had to start this year no matter what is there was just a big disparity experience-wise. You can't go into Maryland with Garrett Greene, who hardly had played, but were you at all surprised that he gave Garrett Greene legit reps in this game maybe earlier than some were predicting?
Well, he had the one drive after the first quarter was over, 21-0. Right. I mean, that makes sense. But then to put Doege back in after a one touchdown drive from Greene, I mean, that was a little surprising, to be honest. But I mean, Doege played well. He made the throws he had to. Maybe he still isn't a great deep ball thrower. That's still evident against a poor team tonight. That's not his game. But I mean, he made the throws tonight. He flashed a little bit of a run game, which isn't going to happen against anyone else probably, but clearly he can run a little bit.
Right.
So, I was a little surprised to see Greene in for one possession and then Doege and Leddie Brown back in the game. But
yeah, that's a good point too, that you bring him in, even if it's earlier than some would have thought. But then once that was so successful, why then did he get the hook?
I mean, it was a touchdown drive from Greene, and then they
and at that point, Jarret Doege hadn't had a touchdown pass, so that was early enough. That was and that could go back to the credence of Neal Brown is sold on Jarret Doege. Jarret Doege is his guy, so that might have been sending a message. Yeah. That might have been sending a message to even Doege, but also to the fan base, to everyone that we're using Greene, but Doege's the guy. Doege is the starter, so that message was clearly sent. And I don't think there's any doubt that obviously Jarret Doege will be starting going into the Virginia Tech game. That would be a shell-shocking scenario if that's somehow not the case, barring injury. But now getting to how they played, because Jarret Doege looked good, 14 for 23, 259, 3 touchdowns. The quarterback rating is just off the charts. You hardly even need to speak about it. It just doesn't, it's almost 200. Garrett Greene, though, 4 for 7, 67 yards, but also 98 yards on the ground on 14 carries, 7 per and 2 touchdowns. So you're looking at a guy that can do it in the air and on the ground. That's a little different of an offense. They're certainly 2 different quarterbacks. I actually had somebody on Twitter tell me that if Neal Brown was going to call the plays he called against Maryland, that those play calls maybe would have translated for Greene. So that might be a discrepancy in which calls you're seeing for the 2 as well. Yeah. But before we get to Greene, anything in this game for Doege that gives you any more reason for optimism that he got better, or do you think he just took advantage of an opponent that he was going to play like this against?
Nothing really stands out to say where he's like, wow, that's a huge improvement. He took the steps. He played like he should have played. And the one problem that I saw in the offense was the offensive line, which still, even against us, a much smaller defensive line, was kind of being manhandled at times. Leddie Brown, he had no room to run on the backfield tonight. And if that's the case moving forward, especially against the Tech defense, which we'll talk about, that could be a disaster for the offense.
Against Virginia Tech of all teams. This is a horrible situation in terms of having the offensive line not be at their best.
After watching Sam Howell out there in the game 1 for UNC, that's my one problem. Doege was good tonight. Right. But, it's LIU. Play against Tech next week, it could be a whole different story with the offensive line in front of them.
Yeah, so we'll get to the offensive line here in a moment, because Leddie Brown, who you bring up, 15 carries, 31 yards, an average of 2.1. It's hard to say that's Leddie Brown. We've seen the best of Leddie Brown. We see what he can do when the offensive line holds. No matter who you are as a running back, you need some protection. But that offensive line being porous, which we knew entering the season it wasn't going to necessarily be a strength, but to be this bad, and it also did not look good against Maryland. Yeah. That's a part of the team that could argue based on competition is progressively looking worse. And you go into Virginia Tech, they're already riding high. They always are a team that is tough against the run, even when they're not good. But of course, having premier defenders, having edge rushers, they could really clamp down defensive line to make that really hard in West Virginia on the ground and put tons of pressure and make Jarret Doege beat them, which in a big game, we've not really yet seen. We've seen it against Long Island. We've seen it maybe, I guess, in a bowl game. But going back to that game against Texas Tech last year, Maryland, we've not really seen that, so that'll be the test. Before we get to that, though, Garrett Greene enters this game. Garrett Greene plays well in this game. Garrett Greene ends up doing it in the air and on the ground. What did you see from him? Because he's been a little bit of an unknown factor. And is there anything that you saw from him in this game that translates that him and Neal Brown could work together, whether it be this year or whether it be beyond this year, because there is a ceiling on how long Jarret Doege will play at West Virginia, regardless of this season, of course.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the biggest thing is he's fast. Garrett Greene's a fast guy. I mean, he's not a very big guy at 5'10",
right,
but he is quick. Even against inferior opponents like tonight, you could tell that he has speed to burn. And pairing that even this year with Leddie Brown with a subpar offensive line where he can run the read option, he can do the RPOs where he can take the ball and run.
Right.
If plays break down, that's very intriguing, especially if the offensive line isn't going to help out with giving him much of a pocket to work with. So I think the possibility for this season, it's there. I still think he's more of a long-term next season kind of guy, because I think Doege is the guy still, and he will be
right.
For most of the season. I think he has a very long leash with Neal Brown, and I think Doege, for all that he is a solid quarterback. Will he win many games by himself? No, but I mean,
right.
It's very. We didn't see much in the air tonight from Greene. I mean, he made some decent throws, but it wasn't like he was.
I was going to ask, obviously he can do it on the ground, and he's an athlete. He has the speed. It's a different offense with him than it would be with Jarret Doege. Would you have any concerns about Garrett Greene being able to be enough of a quarterback? Because this isn't the spread with Pat White, so it's not like you can run every play or have designed run plays. You maybe could sprinkle that in, but I'd imagine that Garrett Greene, in order to be a starter on a bowl team, is going to have to be able to throw it 20 times and complete at least 13, probably. Yeah. Be able to throw 200 yards. His completion percentage was below 60. It's a small sample size on 7 pass attempts, but they weren't as crisp as, say, in comparison to Doege. So unless you become that really all-out running team and change the playbook, that might be another reason why Neal Brown's hesitant to go to Greene, because right now, stylistically, that could still be a concern.
Well, yeah, you mentioned sample size, and that's really the big problem here. Is we're not sure what he is in the air yet. We haven't seen him play much besides him tonight, and most of tonight was him running the ball, which worked very well, and it should work out for him in the long run. But we just, against a team with a great secondary like Virginia Tech, to throw him into the fire like that, it probably won't work out very well for him. And if that ruins his confidence, then what? I mean, if he's afraid if he's got gun shy and won't throw the ball after a potential bad game, I mean, that could be a disaster for his development.
It doesn't get any easier, though. It's not even just Virginia Tech, which we'll certainly preview before we close the show here. You're looking at Virginia Tech, that's a top 20 team that's out of conference, that's renewing a rivalry there. Then Oklahoma, who every now and then they let teams hang around, but not really the Mountaineers. And certainly that's not a team with all their athletes on their defense, even if they're allowing points, that you want to be throwing in an inexperienced quarterback. Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, Iowa State. Iowa State's going to be very, very hungry at that point, you would imagine. Still a very, very good team despite losing to Iowa. So it doesn't get much easier for this schedule. That's why you had to obviously get this win and get this impressive win. That's why the Maryland loss maybe stings so bad. This is the WVU postgame show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live and WV Sports Now. Karl Ludwig. I'm Mike Asti. The Mountaineers win it 66-0 over Long Island. Hard to even have to talk about that anymore, though. That's just a trouncing. It's a boat racing, but that's what West Virginia should do to those teams. Nothing is guaranteed, but you had to get a win like that. And I think it's also good they got a win that's really impressive. Not just 30 points even to beat a spread, but to just basically shellac a team that we've not seen the Mountaineers ever do with Neal Brown. And as you mentioned, it had been since really the Orange Bowl over Clemson to be this dominant offensively against anyone. And they played some quote-unquote inferior opponents that they got big wins against, but not this big. Yeah. So that might be something to at least hang your hat on. Also, the defense posting a shutout after a year of controversy last year, maybe playing above themselves. Last week, maybe playing below themselves, losing Darius Stills. That's big for the defensive confidence as well. You can't undershoot any of that. Speaking about these quarterbacks, though, what would need to happen? And again, I think we agree Neal Brown's riding with Jarret Doege. He wants Jarret Doege to be the guy. He's certainly starting against Virginia Tech. He probably would even start after that game, even if they don't win, because they're certainly not going to be favored. Jarret Doege is probably his guy for better or worse this year. But for you personally, what would need to occur for you to pull the trigger and not only sprinkle Greene in a game, which may occur again, especially with what he's shown on the ground? I wouldn't be shocked if you sprinkle him in. But what would need to happen for you to have Garrett Greene be the starter certainly taking the schedule into account, because if you're worried about killing his confidence, it's then Oklahoma after Virginia Tech. So it doesn't get easier. But what would have to happen for you to switch it up now and go to the future right away?
Well, I think 2 eggs against VT and then Oklahoma would give Greene a great chance to start against Texas Tech with the an easier.
So eggs meaning they got to get beat down, not just lose.
Yeah, I mean, if Doege comes out and is just flat against Virginia Tech, and maybe they give Greene a couple chances in a blowout game, and then they give Doege to start again against Oklahoma, and he just lays an egg again, then I think you kind of have to go with Greene in the Texas Tech game. I mean, at that point you're 1-3. Doege has done nothing for 3 or 4 games. I mean, at that point you have to do something to get a little momentum going.
Okay.
And clearly Greene has shown that he can be a guy who will bring some actual electric gameplay to a game, which Doege isn't going to do. So, I mean, two terrible games against VT and Oklahoma, and I think Greene probably starts against Texas Tech.
Yeah, and that would be ironic with the Texas Tech connection and how that was really his worst game last year, and that being on the road back home, and that connection and his personal connection and being from Lubbock, Texas. But it's not going to be easy. That was the problem, again, of not looking great against Maryland. Not only losing, it's one thing to lose, but to be so bad and have that be an issue where the conversation churns, because this schedule was not going to get easier. So it does kind of lend it. That's why I clarified on the beat down. For me, I think you'd have to get beat down and he'd have to really, really suck. I'm probably expecting West Virginia to lose both of those 2 games. So to say they have to win them would be almost unreasonable. But I think there's a difference between losing them and not even showing up, not even be competitive, and playing like he did against Maryland, certainly turnover-wise. So we will see what the trigger is for Neal Brown here. Again, Karl Ludwig, Mike Asti here on the WVU postgame show here on PSL. Hit that subscribe button if you're watching or listening to the show. This will also live over there at WV Sports Now, where all our postgame coverage currently is. Now, you mentioned the offensive line. You mentioned Leddie Brown. You mentioned that being concerned moving forward. Obviously, when you win big like this, it's hard to take too many negatives out of the game. But what are your concerns, aside from the quarterback conversation, going into Virginia Tech? What needs corrected? What did you still notice in this game that needs cleaned up that you just will not be able to in any way get away with against the Hokies?
Well, I mean, tonight the defense looked pretty good. Just to go on the upside of the ball for a minute, I mean, they look good, but then again, I mean, they weren't playing much of an offense. I mean, they held them to 100 yards total, which is great. Shutout, awesome. But I mean, they faced a great Maryland offense, which they probably won't face as good as that one this season again.
Yeah.
But tackling was an issue. I mean, secondary coverage was an issue. And tackling is probably the biggest. They had to fix tackling issues. I mean, Virginia Tech has some good athletes. They have a quarterback who can run the ball, just like Tulia Tagovailoa with Maryland. So, I mean, they're going to have another test here soon with a team that's offense isn't as good, but the defense more than makes up for it. So the defense obviously has some things to show still. On the offense, like you said, in tonight's game, not much of a – you can't nitpick too hard tonight. Everyone looked pretty good. The receivers made some great plays with the balls in their hand after the catch. We saw some RB depth tonight with a couple younger guys stepping up when Leddie Brown was kind of given a little side seat. So, I mean, really it's just the offensive line has to really stout up and make some key blocks to open holes for Leddie Brown and maybe Garrett Greene in the future. And then we'll have to see with Virginia Tech up next.
Yeah, what does Virginia Tech do well, though, for any Mountaineer fans that aren't as familiar with Virginia Tech, possibly, that is going to give the Mountaineers problems? What does West Virginia need to do against Virginia Tech in particular, outside of just cleaning up the offensive line? But in this particular matchup, would it be better to make it the Leddie Brown show? Does Garrett Greene or Jarret Doege, if they mix them both in, certainly Doege starting, need to do it through the air? Is that even going to be possible? And then what kind of test will this be for the West Virginia defense and what Virginia Tech brings to the table?
Well, I mean, Virginia Tech came out obviously with a great week 1 game against UNC. They dominated Sam Howell with 3 picks, 5 sacks, 5, 6, 7 sacks in the game. I mean, if he's not launching the ball around the field, we can pretty much assume that Doege won't as well. I mean, they have a great secondary, so Doege's gonna have to be very clean and accurate with the ball. I mean, he won't have much leeway into making any throws like he did against Maryland. I mean, he'll have to be on his game and sharp with his accuracy and
yeah, you can't. West Virginia cannot lose the turnover battle and win the game.
No, they can't. They cannot. There's no chance against this defense. I mean, and then their D line is also swarming. They had like 5 or 6, 7 sacks against Howe. They dominated the UNC offensive line, and that's a problem right now for West Virginia. So if they can dominate a good offensive line and QB combo like UNC,
UNC maybe the best quarterback. They're one of the better quarterbacks in the country. Right.
So I mean, it's just they'll have to be on their game and sharp from the get-go. Doege has to have very good pocket presence and protection of the ball. The offensive line is going to have to make some holds for Leddie Brown to go early. He'll have to be going from the first snap. He'll have to be involved in the game in a big way, either with a lot of carries or with some screens out of the backfield. He has to be a big part of the game. Tonight's game can't happen again against Virginia Tech or they'll lose the game. It's that simple.
For me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, obviously Leddie Brown's a beast. Obviously Leddie Brown last year proved himself. Obviously Leddie Brown's the best player on this team.
Yeah.
Has a chance to be one of the better players in college football, better players in the Big 12 if he's on his game. But if you look at the amount of carries he had in week 1 in the Maryland loss, and that is a major conference opponent, and a lot of that was they were playing catch up the whole second half. So of course you're going to have to throw the ball, but 17 carries there, 15 carries in this game, involved in the offense in other ways, of course, sometimes even as a receiver. But number one, do you have any concern the fact that he's almost, based on his workload, in almost a preseason mode? I mean, he's barely got to a total workload that would give you one game. He's combining for basically 30 carries. That's usually one game. We're now 2 games in. Strategizing in this Long Island game, would you have liked to have seen, even though it wasn't working out, 2.1 yards per carry, the offensive line being so bad, since you know the win is guaranteed, yes, you need to figure out things quarterback-wise, but would you have liked to see Neal Brown just give more of the rock to Leddie Brown to work him out more potentially? And is that at all an issue going into Virginia Tech, where he's going to need to be utilized a lot more, and he basically has had one game of work through 2 games?
I wouldn't say it's an issue right now. I mean, I think it's nice to have him not like kind of beaten down after two big games where he has a lot of carries. I think he's still pretty fresh. I mean, he looked good against Maryland. Tonight wasn't his night. I mean, everyone has off nights, but I think they'll have to get him involved early, both in the passing game and with a lot of carries. So, I mean, the offense runs with him. If he's not running well against Virginia Tech, Mountaineer offense isn't going to do much. I mean, he has to be the focal point, the guy who can open up passing lanes for Doege or Garrett Greene if he's in the game. And it kind of goes twofold, where Doege has to be a guy who can have an actual threat with the ball in his hands to open those lanes up for Leddie Brown, and it goes hand in hand. And the offensive line just really hasn't been very good so far. It's a young offensive line at parts. I mean, there's some new guys like Doug Nestor, Wyatt Millam still. It's a second game tonight. So, I mean, there's room to grow, but they don't have much time to continue to gel. I mean,
that's right. Yeah.
It's now or never. I mean, they have their 2 toughest games of the season up next, and if the offensive line can't gel, it could be a long night for the next 2 weekends. I mean, it's just. Leddie Brown probably is the biggest issue. I think he'll be fine, but the team around him has to kind of step up to allow him to be what he needs to be.
Yeah, you need the offensive line to play much better. Honestly, there's been so much attention, and we are guilty of this too, but everybody is. There's been so much attention put on the quarterback, whether it be Jarret Doege or a kind of fan-manufactured quarterback controversy of just wanting Garrett Greene, finally seeing more of Garrett Greene, so that's only going to fuel that fire. And certainly other issues that went on against Maryland, hard to gauge things against Long Island, but the underrated story that we did touch on is the offensive line has just not been good. That has not got enough attention. And if that offensive line does not play better, Garrett Greene's not going to be able to do what he did against Long Island against anybody else, because the offensive line is not going to give him those blocks to do it on the ground. So that's going to be a major issue. Now, on the flip side, just to get a chatter I do see involved here, as we're getting a comment here, defense needs to put more pressure on the quarterback. Any issue for you to this point with West Virginia's defense? Obviously, Darius Still's gone. Dante Still's now the leader of the defensive line. A shutout in this game. Long Island's offense not really able to get moving. Their offense isn't that great, though, in the first place, even for their level. But I guess if you include the Maryland game, Tua, a great quarterback with a quick release, dominant arm strength. Maybe he's not the best of example, but not the pressure that you saw from West Virginia in past years that was making West Virginia's defense such a difficult defense to play against for a quarterback. Not the case against Maryland. Hard to gauge things against Long Island, but any concerns for you in terms of West Virginia's pressure on the opposing quarterback, which will again become an issue moving forward very quickly?
Well, maybe not concerned, but definitely a consideration and something to watch as the season wears on. I mean, the secondary isn't a strength right now, so as much pressure as they can get from the D line is going to help out in any way it can. I mean, there's a lot of talent there. Mesidor is a rising star, absolute stud. Looked great tonight. You still have Dante still is there. You still have a lot of talented guys, but yeah, I mean they're going to have more games where they can get 3 or 4 or 5 sacks a game to just kind of disrupt the flow of the game and to get the secondary to have a little bit of time and momentum to make some plays back there as well. I mean, you saw the Maryland game. Tulia had all kinds of time to throw the ball, and he did, and he slung it around the field, and the secondary couldn't stop him. But there's not much they can do if he can sit back there and just pick off opponents. And he's a good quarterback, but the Big 12 has plenty of good quarterbacks. That won't be an outlier this season. They'll face plenty of guys who can throw the ball around. So,
right, and even if they're going to deal with Virginia Tech, who maybe would prefer to run Oklahoma right away after that, Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, Iowa State, Oklahoma State, etc. You're going to face quarterbacks. You're going to face quarterbacks. It's the Big 12 still. Who knows what it'll be as we stand? It's the Big 12 with these teams, and they're dealing with quarterbacks who maybe they're not going to win the Heisman, but they're certainly going to be able to toss around against seeing a weaker secondary, and I feel like that was not as much of an issue for West Virginia last year because the defensive line was so good. They could put that pressure on. That's not what we're seeing so far this year. Again, a 66-0 shellacking, a boat racing of Long Island. It's hard to gauge things off of that game. Certainly looked good all throughout the game, although it is interesting as we had to couldn't make it all sunshine and rainbows. We had to pick apart it as much as we could, but it does make you think there's a lot more to pick apart in a 66-0 game than you normally would get out of a 66-0 game, which maybe gives you concern that this score was only 66-0 because of the opponent then. So West Virginia's test then, again, becomes that game against Virginia Tech, what they can do against the Hokies. They got to, at minimum, show up and make that a competitive game, or it'll bring all that conversation back about how much of the climb should be trusted, and Doege versus Greene. It does not get much easier after that. Karl, I definitely appreciate the time. I'll let you get back to watching the rest of college football here on this still late summer that I'm hanging on to close to fall. Saturday, we've already had some big games going on today. We already had a big upset. Certainly Ohio State losing at home is one, even though to a big, good and big Oregon team. So that's something to keep an eye on. Notre Dame once again skates through and gets another victory, but Iowa State losing, that maybe leaves the door open there. They didn't lose in conference, but it adds a loss to another Big 12 team. So we'll let you go and watch the rest of the games here this evening. Appreciate the time once again. You want to head over to WV Sports now for all our postgame coverage of this win for West Virginia. And it is all about now Virginia Tech. You wanted the rivalry. The rivalry's back. Playing well against Virginia Tech, even a win against Virginia Tech, will make people shut up, myself included, about Maryland. But if you don't, it's all going to be the totality of the problem this year, and Long Island will not be anything to brag about. So that is the test. That is the big deal. Neal Brown still needs a staple victory 3 years in. Jarret Doege needs a staple victory 3 years in. Certainly in the regular season, that would be it. But that is not going to be easy to say. The very, very least, the Mountaineers get a big win. But look at the opponent. It's hard to gauge it, but they get a win. They get it at home. The fans celebrate. That's a positive for the Mountaineers. They now have a big test